So we have a good group of us here now. So again, for those that have just joined us, I am Jackie Bell, the coordinator for the Disaster Resilient Future Ready program with the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, and I'll be your host today. I'm joining you today from Maribyrnong in Melbourne, and would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country in which I'm placed, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their care, stewardship, resilience and connection to the land, sea and community over many thousands of years. I also acknowledge traditional owners of the lands that you're all meeting and joining from today. And I pay my respects to traditional owners that are here with us today in the workshop. I'd like to welcome you all here and thank you for making time out of what I'm sure is a busy schedule to jump online and join this conversation. For those that don't know FRRR very much, we're the only national foundation that's specifically focused on ensuring social and economic strength in remote, rural and regional areas of Australia. And we align government, philanthropic and community purposes and investments. We were created in 2000 out of a recognition that many remote and rural communities were doing it tough and had little access to philanthropic funding from outside their communities. Our purpose as an organisation is pretty clear and simple. We connect goodwill with good purpose for the vitality of remote, rural and regional communities across Australia. So our model's pretty unique. We leverage different forms of capital through a collective funding model, and we broker that funding and we share insights and learning to contribute to improved practice and support for communities around Australia. Most of you probably know FRRR through a specific grant that you may have received or a program you applied funding to. But we also have other community development place-based programs where we've partnered with communities like the Disaster Resilient Future Ready program, and which is what we'll be speaking to you more about today. So over the past few months, I've been incredibly privileged to connect with a lot of you and learn about the work you're all doing as individuals, groups and networks to support connection, wellbeing, communication, information sharing and disaster preparedness in your communities. This session today has come about as a result of these conversations, as we've heard that resilience is often a word that's thrown around without really much time being spent to think about and discuss what we're really talking about and what it means to a person, to an individual, to a community, to a local system or network. So spending time to have a conversation exploring the themes and aspects of community resilience and what makes it unique to a specific community is really important. Particularly so when considering how and in what ways a community might act collectively or individually to strengthen their existing local capacity so that the community can continue to thrive and evolve in positive ways in times of disasters and other disruptions. So the purpose of today's session is not to provide a definitive answer to the question of what is community resilience, but instead provide a space to learn and explore some of the themes and concepts relating to community resilience and catalyse some further thinking about what it means to you and your community. We'll be hearing from our guest speaker about this in more detail very shortly. And then following that, we will break out into small groups for a discussion about what was shared. And then we'll come back to the main room for an overview of the Disaster Resilient Future Ready program and the supports that are available through participation in one of the two different program streams over the next 2 years. So I'm going to stop sharing. And to get us started, I'm just going to do that. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce Paul Ryan from the Australian Centre for Disaster Resilience. Paul is passionate about the future of rural people and places. And since growing up on the family farm, he has worked with rural communities around Australia and internationally to bring about positive social, environmental and economic change. He's worked with more than 20,000 people using a range of concepts and tools to catalyse new thinking and insights over the last 15 years. And is acutely aware of both challenges and opportunities faced by rural Australia to create prosperous, sustainable and fair futures for rural people. As I said, Paul is the director of the Australian Resilience Centre and Has previously worked for the Stockholm Resilience Centre also, as well as CSIRO and some state agencies. I know I learn a lot from Paul every time we get into a really big chat, and so I'm delighted today to have him here to join us all and chat with you all too. Paul, I'll invite you to turn on your mic and share your screen when you're ready.
Yeah.
And I will mute myself and you're on your way.
Great. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks for the introduction. I learn a lot from you as well every time we have a conversation. And thanks for the invitation to come along and have a chat today. I'm really excited. Such a great group of people. And thanks for everyone for joining and making the time. We know it's a really busy time for everyone, and particularly with the the news fluctuating about COVID and all sorts of things. So and thanks for the work that you do. Jackie mentioned the range of things that people are doing in their communities, and so thanks for that. It's not easy, and I understand this, the challenges that people face in communities trying to do this sort of work. So what I want to do today is really just talk about our experience and the way we think about resilience, and just share a few ideas and sort of perspectives. It's not, as Jackie said, we're not trying to really define hard and fast what community resilience is or how you should think about it in any way, shape or form. I'm really focused here on just talking about some ideas. So can you see the screen there, Jackie? Can everyone see that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So, we know resilience is one of the sort of overused buzzwords that's thrown around all the time. If you click on the news, you're going to see the word resilience somewhere in an article mentioned within a few minutes. The way that we tend to think about resilience is sort of, we try to move past that kind of popular use of the term, if you like. So that's what I want to do for a start, is just talk a little bit about how we think about resilience and frame it, and then get into some detail about different ways to sort of look at resilience. So I should mention my favourite, use of resilience is always the kind of what I call footy philosophy, where you've got some coach every weekend is saying about, the great resilience of a team or a player or a coach or whatever show. That's always appeals to me. There's lots of different kind of disciplines, if you like, or different scales of resilience that people talk about, and you'll see and hear people talking about psychological personal resilience. So that's obviously about the individual and about the psychological traits they have to cope with stresses. You'll hear people talking about community and disaster, so that's obviously talking about the sort of events and impacts that communities have to cope with. Disaster resilience tends to be more about the formal responses that, particularly sort of institutions and government organisations and, the emergency services. And then there's system and engineering resilience, which really is about how different parts of the world around us work, like infrastructure and things like that. And you'll often hear a mixture of all of these in the same conversation. In our work, we're dealing with, say, bushfire recovery communities. You'll hear people talking across all of these. They'll be talking about psychological resilience and mental health because of, a disaster, and they'll be talking about infrastructure failure, all in the same sentence and in the same discussion. And it really depends on who's talking and what lens they're using and which way they might be sort of coming at resilience. And I don't want to sort of impose any particular kind of focus here around these different sort of perspectives, just to be aware that there are different ways of thinking about it. These different ways of thinking about resilience have attached to them, these disciplines particularly have different theory and different tools and different concepts embedded in them. And it does matter sometimes where someone's coming from. So it's important, if you're talking about resilience, to be kind of clear about what direction you're sort of coming at it from. If we talk about, what's a definition of resilience, here's a really broad generic definition. And I'm going to come back to this definition a bit later and add some detail and flesh it out. But at a really broad level, we can talk about resilience as the capacity of something to cope with change and continue to function in positive ways. And so, the common theme across all of those different ways to think about resilience is it's about having some kind of capacity or attribute of something to cope with change and continue to function in positive ways. I also just up front want to kind of move beyond some of the sort of popular rhetoric, resilience rhetoric that we hear, that resilience is just about bouncing back. Resilience is more than just bouncing back. It's actually, in most of the cases that we deal with, it's about bouncing somewhere new. People don't just want to get back to where they were. They want to move beyond that. And sometimes, you don't want to get back to where you were. If you were in a bad situation before an impact or an event or some sort of disruption, you don't necessarily want to just get back to where you were. You might want to go somewhere else. So that's it's not a helpful idea, really, thinking about just bouncing back. Resilience is more about being flexible than being tough, stubborn or strong. And, we hear this all the time in our work, that, people are sort of, country people and rural people are tough. Everyone is vulnerable. That's what I've learned over the long period of time and dealing with lots of people. Everyone is vulnerable in some way at some time. So even the sort of toughest kind of, my dad's an 85-year-old farmer, and I was over there on the weekend and he ripped his hand open. He's tough as bloody nails, but he's really vulnerable too. He actually doesn't have a lot of skills in the world to navigate the world, for example. And resilience is not always good. There are costs and trade-offs when we're building resilience. Not everything and everyone can be resilient to all things all the time. And there is a cost. There is a cost for building resilience, and it takes time and it takes money to build resilience. So we need to just keep those things in mind, that, people sort of throw around the term resilience like it's always good. Some things that are very resilient are actually quite negative. So some social dynamics, for example, institutional welfare dependency is an example. It's very resilient kind of dynamic, social dynamic. It's not desirable. We actually want to change that. So sometimes we might want to break down and, sort of make something less resilient if it's not doing what we want it to do, or not serving our community in the way we'd like. So they're just some really background kind of things, and we can come back to those in the discussion if people would like to. But what I want to do now is really focus on how we try to think about resilience, and the kind of this idea of two lenses that we bring to trying to think about resilience. And the first one is what I'm just going to call the stress lens, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. And the second one is a systems lens. And so, this has emerged for us over a long period of time. I started from looking at things from a system lens, and over time I've really had to work at kind of understanding the stress lens because of the way that, people that we work with and interact with are kind of expressing what they need and what's happening to them in their communities. And so really for us, we try to bring both of these lenses now and bring those both to bear. So when we think about this kind of stress lens idea, we need to sort of go back a step and in fact go back quite a big step, about maybe 4 or 5 million years ago, and think about our cousins, our ancestors on the savannas in Africa. These are small, insignificant creatures in the world, on the planet, and subject to a lot of stress in their lives. But that stress had a particular kind of dynamic to it, and that is this sort of peak of stress. So if we think about, an event, and there's a kind of peak of stress, but then things go back to normal. And this is the fight or flight response, and what we have in our brains and what's come from our ancestors. And in fact, it goes back not just 4 or 5 million years to early humans and apes, but actually it goes right back. It goes back to the early mammals, and it goes back beyond that to the reptiles, right back to the fish, to the first critters in the ocean. They all had to deal with the fight or flight response. What that's done is left us in the ancient part of our brains with the machinery to deal with stress. And there's different parts of it, but a key part here is the amygdala highlighted, and there's a hypothalamus and the various glands and the adrenal glands, etc. That what happens is when we have a stressful event, our body scans for those events, is constantly scanning for threats and dangers and things that impact on us. And then we have this machinery that kicks in when we sense that danger. And that can be the fight or flight response. And that triggers a whole series of kind of chemical reactions in our body that cause us to kind of react in certain ways. It creates physiological changes and it creates psychological changes in us. And that machinery then also does something really important, is it stores the memories of those events, and it stores those in ways that we can draw on them really quickly, so that in the future, if we're out, you know, on the savannah and we see or hear a lion roar, we remember what happened last time and we know what the action needs to be. That's really useful when you're out on the savannah, and you know, we all had this kind of machinery in our brains, but it's a bit less useful in our lives, and I'll get to that in a minute. So for these you know, critters, they'd have this stressful event. Most of the time they'd be operating in a reasonably comfortable zone. You'd have a stressful event and you're in this kind of red zone. The event happens as that kind of response, but then our body is designed to go back down to a kind of happy state, some form of happy state. We're actually not designed to stay up in that red zone. So for our ancestors, you know, that was the way they operated. If you think about, for us in the modern world, and think about the stresses that we're subject to, we've got the same machinery in our heads. It has not changed. It is in this ancient part of our brain. We have exactly the same machinery. It's designed to do exactly the same job. So think about what's happening in our lives and what our kind of stress curve, this you know, this kind of graph, and I've just made this up here obviously, but this kind of stress curve, but think about what that looks like for a person in a community, and all of the stresses that we have to deal with. And you know, that's why we're here, is thinking about these kind of peak type events, but there's also a whole lot of things that happen in people's lives every day that mean that we're constantly dealing with sort of stressful events, and the legacy, you know, the way that machinery works, it locks all that away, it keeps triggering, and our brain, you know, is trying to do us a favor, but in fact it makes us sort of hyper alert. And so our kind of, you know, response is we're getting up into this sort of stress zone, the high stress zone, the red zone, and we're actually getting stuck there with there's some physiological and psychological feedbacks that kick in, and we actually end up staying up in this zone, and it gets harder and harder for us to get back down into the kind of happy zone, and we spend more and more time in this stress zone, and that's not good for us. And you know, as human beings, that's one of the worst places we can be, is in this high stress state. And I won't go through all of these in detail, but we just look at the top ones here. These are you know, documented effects of stress with lots of studies to back it up. But so if we look at, you know, changes in brain structure and function, headaches, lack of energy, nervousness, anger, irritability, trouble concentrating, memory issues, insomnia, anxiety. Does any of this sound familiar to all of us, you know, particularly in recent times? Panic attacks, despair, sadness. And if these things continue, you know, mental health problems, recognisable mental health problems like depression, and then in longer term risk of dementia. There's a bunch of other physiological responses there, heart, digestive, you know, the rest. But clearly this is not a great place for people to be. You know, we don't want, certainly I don't want to be here, I don't want my family, I don't want my friends, my community to be in this kind of physiologically stressed state. And it has, you know, impacts on us physiologically and mentally. But you know, we can sort of look at those and go, okay, that's concerning. But there's also this other side of it as well, which is over on the left here. These are from studies looking at people's decision making under stress. So people under stress make more advantageous decisions, and they take more risks than non-stress conditions. The presence of a stressor may generally result in a failure to attend to the full range of possible consequences of a decision. And then down the bottom there, stressed individuals fixated on themselves and ignored the negative consequences of their choices on others. So stress is not just an individual problem. Stress actually becomes a problem for the people around us, and for our wider community. If we've got people making, you know, decisions that impact not just themselves, but other people, and you can see how this sort of transmits out, that people operating in this kind of high stress world and high stress state, physiologically they're impacting on themselves and psychologically, but then that starts to transmit out. And clearly we can't have a functional, viable community if we've got, you know, numbers of people that are in this kind of state and dealing with stresses you know, in an ongoing way, it's going to transmit out. It's going to limit a whole range of things. And ultimately, disruptive events, the sort of things that we're interested in talking about in this conversation, and adversity expresses as stress on individuals. That stress causes problems for individuals, but it causes problems for those around them, and eventually it becomes a collective problem. And there's a range of, you know, reasons why we can, you know, why we should think about individuals, of course, but from our perspective here, you know, talking much more about this collective, this kind of collective problem. And it means that disruptive events, even though they translate into stress on individuals, it becomes a community problem, and it limits our community's potential as well as the individuals. And so it's a people process. This is not about necessarily about, you know, big events, of course, are dramatic, and we see the loss of, you know, infrastructure and all sorts of things and impacts on that. But it's actually about people. And if we put people at the centre, resilience becomes very much about care and compassion and empathy, and looking after one another. Because if we don't, we end up in this situation where we have this transmitting stress. Having said that, you know, there is an economic cost here too, and the direct costs of a disaster like a major bushfire, for example, we see that the direct costs of infrastructure damage, the loss of houses and property, those sorts of things, loss of production are massive. But the indirect and intangible costs, so this is the disruption to work, mental health problems, mental health and wellbeing problems, family breakdown, loss of community connection, are significantly greater than the physical damage costs. So Deloitte Economics did a bit of work, you know, the Black Saturday fires, you know, the direct costs were about $3.1 billion in terms of damage and infrastructure, but the indirect costs, these intangible, you know, impacts on community, were about 3.9, nearly 3.4, nearly $4 billion, sorry. So, you know, a significantly greater cost in terms of these indirect and intangible costs if we want to look for an economic argument. So that's the kind of stress lens, is, you know, thinking about this as a people problem, and thinking about how the impact of those events and how they transmit through to individuals, and then that transmits back out. And we know, and I you know, I don't need to go into the details obviously, but we know that there's significant increases in domestic violence, in family violence following events. We know that there's increases in substance abuse, there's increases in mental health issues in communities, and then those stresses transmit on to other generations. So you get this kind of intergenerational kind of impact of these things. So the children from Black Saturday, for example, lag behind still in terms of their NAPLAN scores and those sorts of things a decade down the track. So that's the kind of system lens, stress lens. And then the other lens that we can bring to this to sort of understand and think about this is this idea of a system lens. And again, we hear the word system thrown around a lot, but a system really is you know, the connections and between things. And if we think about a person, you know, look at all of us sitting here, we're all at the moment connected on this call by a technological system, and we're all embedded in a whole series of different systems at our, you know, our house. We're embedded in a bunch of electrical systems and pipes and, you know, communications. We're connected into a social system, we're connected into a natural system, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're surrounded by a system. So we think about the social side, you know, we're might be part of a family, and we've certainly all come from a family. We might be, you know, part of a farming system that's also a business, and we're part of a business system. We're, you know, living and working in an ecosystem and getting lots of benefits from an ecosystem. We're embedded in a governance system, a local government system, and then things like local networks of infrastructure. And then, of course, they're nested in bigger networks of things. So for you know, the kind of social dimension here, where every family is embedded in some sort of community. From a farming point of view, you're in part of an industry or a production chain. Business, you're part of a local economy. Ecosystems, you're part of a landscape, et cetera, et cetera. Governance is state government. Energy grids and networks. And so we're actually embedded in systems of systems, and we are inherently kind of operating every day in every way as part of systems. And so we can start to then use that sort of thinking to help us understand what are the disruptions, what are the impacts of different things happening around us, and from a resilience point of view. So, and we can think at the kind of high level at this sort of, headline sort of level of social infrastructure, natural economic production, governance, and there's others that can go around the outside there. So if we think about these systems, they experience changes, and some of those changes sort of come from outside and impact on us within that system. And if we think about social things, there's things like ageing and disability, gender inequality, cultural background, racism, language barriers, social isolation, and they tend to be fairly slow things that change, but they create vulnerabilities for people by being in certain situations and being part of certain dynamics that are listed there. Some things are more dramatic, and will impact on us directly. They've sort of fast changes. So these are things like natural disasters that a lot of us on this call are interested in or have experienced. And, we can go around here, there's a bunch of things: siloed government services, inadequate or delayed services, before or during or after an event, or just, the loss of services in small communities, punitive public policies, the robo-debt type stuff that governments, occasionally get drastically wrong, and can really have an impact on individuals. And some of these things can be fast or slow, and some are small events. They happen within the system close to us. Some come from outside. I won't list all of these, and some are combinations of fast and slow, but all of these things are dynamics that are happening around us in systems all the time. And some of the changes are slow, and then on top of that, we get fast changes. The spread of COVID, the arrival and spread of COVID is one that's fast and, unknown to us. It's come from outside the system. Other things come from inside the system. They might change slowly. Things like just ageing in communities, loss of volunteers, those types of changes that are sort of background changes almost. But it tends to, what we see in our work is that it tends to be these slow changes that sort of grind you to the edge, and then some kind of fast change, a natural disaster or change in government policy, an economic change, change in the price of a commodity, whatever it might be, is a thing that tips people over the edge. And so we can actually bring this lens of system understanding to understand our community, how it's changing, and why is it changing, in what ways is it changing, which part of the system is changing that we should be concerned about, which parts of the system are vulnerable, and which people become vulnerable because of certain changes. So we can actually sort of bring these two together. People embedded in systems become vulnerable or become exposed to different types of things because of the changes I just talked about. That creates stress for individuals, and as I said, that stress then feeds back on the system, because individuals that are under stress, require certain things, and also can impact on people and individuals around them. So if you like, this kind of stress lens really gives us a why to think about resilience and community resilience. It's a purpose or a kind of rationale to say, well, actually, we all want to live in good communities. We all want our communities to be viable and vibrant, and we want everyone in those communities to kind of have the best opportunity to experience the best health and well-being. And so we can sort of put that at the centre of thinking about resilience. But we, to understand that and how that works, we also need to take this broader kind of system lens and put that stress in context of the system. And so the system lens becomes a kind of how to understand resilience in our communities and how it's changing, and why is it changing, and what's causing the stress. Sometimes it's the sharp event, sometimes it's this sort of slow change, and sometimes they work in combination, as I said. And of course, that kind of cycle of, why and how is the constant work of thinking about resilience. There's never a point where you fully understand everything and that's it. It's always kind of evolving and changing, and it's a dynamic over time. There's never a point when you say this community is resilient, we can walk away. There's community resilience changes over time because of those system changes. So if we come back to this definition now, that, like I said earlier, this is a fairly generic kind of, overarching definition, but we can start to put a bit more shape around it and say resilience is the capacity of people, communities and systems. And we can define that, it might be the capacity of these people in this community, as part of these systems to cope with change. And we can be more explicit about that, about cope with the change in the systems around them. And we could be explicit about which systems, and we can start to say, well, in changes in, the social system, or changes in the production system or the industrial system or whatever, or combinations of those things. The capacity to cope with that change in those systems, and the individual and collective stresses that it causes on us, or it causes on our community, and then continue to function in positive ways. And it's important here to stress that lots of people kind of cope, but often the coping is not positive. They're coping in ways, self-medicating with alcohol, for example, or expressing lots of personality traits in ways that are not helpful to their life and to their community, whatever. So the positive way bit's important as well. But so we can flesh out this definition in the context of our community and what we're trying to do, and how we're trying to think about it. And so, it's really up for communities to kind of define their own definition of what resilience means for them in their community, and the ways that they want to think about it and cope. Obviously, we can't work with every individual to manage stress. That's just not practical. Most of the communities that people are online here from are, many thousands of people, and we clearly can't work at the individual level, but we can work with groups of people and the systems that they're embedded in. So, that the system side of this helps us to work on the kind of stress side, because of our ability to work with groups of people and systems, and the people that manage those systems, whereas we can't necessarily work with every individual, and people don't necessarily want to be worked on, in terms of stress. They want to just live their lives. And so really the kind of systems perspective is a way in to work on this problem at the right scale. And we know that we can get lots of people together and do this stuff. And lots of people on this call have been doing this sort of work, and getting people together and working through it, and identifying and sharing, your insights and understanding of what the system is and how it's changing, where we want to go and where we don't want to go. And there's lots of tools to work with, and we use a whole range of different tools, but they all sort of have some common characteristics in that they help explore different dynamics. And in this case, this is this iceberg diagram that we've picked up and used and adopted from various other sources of versions of this that people would have seen. And really, this is the kind of the top of the iceberg here, is about the stresses that a system undergoes, and that gets all our focus. And we need to work on that. Obviously, when there's big events, we need to work with people to help them to prepare and recover from those big shocks and events that people see. But actually trying to change in the longer term, we need to move below the water and look at the pattern of those events, and look at the patterns and processes of the way systems are changing. We need to look at the system structure. How's it organised? Where and how are we organising ourselves? And is that making some of us more vulnerable to certain types of events? Is it, to do with our economy? Is it to do with our physical landscape, our infrastructure, our planning, our thinking, all sorts of stuff? And so it's actually down here deep in the kind of under the water where we start to talk about being adaptive, where we can start to adapt and avoid some future shocks and events, or learn how to cope better with them when they happen, when we simply can't avoid them. And right at the bottom there is the kind of really transformative stuff, which is changing the way we think about these problems. But this is just a tool, and it's just a simple way to structure a conversation, but really it tries to deal with both that kind of stress lens and the system lens, and bring those two things together. This is another one I'm not going to go through in detail, but this is called 3 Horizons, which is a way just to think about the future. And again, it looks at the stresses, so it looks at what's stressing the community, and then it looks at what are the system changes that are needed to get to the desirable future. And these are just ways to have structured conversations through something that's really quite messy. You know, there's lots of bits and pieces here that are quite messy and hard to understand. These things just help us to have those conversations. And so we use a whole range of tools, and you know, there's lots of tools out there to use to help people to understand the world around them and understand, you know, particularly from a systems perspective, how systems work or not working, where are they vulnerable, and how might they change into the future. And, you know, obviously that's a key part of thinking about managing community resilience, is thinking about the challenges that will emerge. It's not necessarily about thinking about what's happened in the past, although that's really informative. It's really trying to think about what are the types of stresses that our community will be subject to in the future? How will they impact on the systems that we rely on? How will that disrupt the pattern of people's daily lives? And therefore, you know, what can we do about that? So last couple of things I just want to talk about. The first is that, you know, I really firmly believe that communities themselves are best placed to understand and build resilience, because they know the people, they know the place, and they know the systems that make that place work. And so this is not something that can be done from outside by government or from top down. It actually has to come from within. It's an incredibly sort of, you know, intimate process to understand your community and understand its vulnerability and who's vulnerable and why. And that can only be done by people who know the place. That doesn't mean you have to do all the work to fix those things, but certainly, you know, I think community should be at the centre of trying to understand their resilience and trying to work out what they're going to do about that, enabled and in partnership and supported by government. But actually community should be leading. Doesn't mean you do all the work, but you should be at front and centre in trying to understand and decide on the future. And, you know, people in place are intimately connected. People from outside don't understand necessarily the kind of, you know, the dynamics of that place at that intimate scale, and that really can only come from living and being in that place. I want to finish now with just talking about a quick example of exactly that, a community taking the lead and taking charge of how they wanted to think about resilience in their community. And it comes from a little group in a place called Yeovil, a little place south of Dubbo. Not a lot happening in downtown Yeovil. It's a small community, about 300 people, surrounded by a big farming community. And it falls at the centre of kind of the boundaries of 3 local governments. It's between, you know, a couple of big, much bigger communities. It's a classic kind of middle of nowhere sort of place. It's sort of nowhere and everywhere all at once. And this community had felt for a long time, they'd suffered a range of really difficult challenges in the community, you know, long-running drought, some big impacts on production, a disease outbreak that quarantined a number of properties for 9 months. They'd had a number of kind of natural disasters, but they'd also had some, you know, significant things in the community, a car crash that killed 2 really, you know, highly regarded community leaders and things like that, that sort of accumulated over time for the community, and they really wanted to do something about it. So a group of people, just a little ragtag bunch of really great people from all sorts of things, the local church, the local schools, a couple of the agencies, and then just a bunch of farmers, the fire brigades, you know, rural fire brigades, those sorts of things, got together and started a process to talk about resilience. And they worked through a whole bunch of things. And one of the things I did with them in the first session was I asked them to come along and tell a story about resilience and just what it meant to them. And it was just an unbelievable session, and just to hear the stories of people's own personal resilience and the challenges they'd faced, and you know, particularly things like mental health and suicides and things like that, but also the challenge of coping with the ups and downs in a small rural community and farming. But one of the guys brought along this little jar, and you can see there it's a sort of melted jar. It's one of those Fowler's preserving jars. And he just told this story. He'd pulled it out of the ashes of his parents' farmhouse that had burnt down in some big fires up there in about 4 or 5 years ago. And he just told the story about how people, his mother had been great preserver of fruit. They had an orchard, little orchard there, and she preserved fruit and preserved all the vegetables and all this kind of stuff. And everyone that came to the house went away with a jar of some preserved fruit or veggies or something. And after the house burnt down, you know, they had nothing left, and the absolutely devastated, lost completely everything, burnt the whole farm, lost a lot of stock, all the fences, and the house, you know, completely gone. And this guy told this story about how suddenly boxes of these jars started just turning up and, you know, being left just at the front gate, and then one of the old preserving things, the boilers, and then white goods and all sorts of stuff. And he said it was just totally uncoordinated, but it just started happening, and it went on for many months, to the point where they were having to give away stuff to other people that were affected by the fires. And, you know, what he sort of, the message he had was actually what his mother had done by, you know, handing out a jar of fruit to everyone that came to the property and all of that stuff, was that she just built all these connections, and she created a network, a web of people that were connected in ways, you know, through this sort of idea of reciprocity, that she'd given them something and then they were just giving it back, and it became a really powerful sort of symbol and idea for the whole process. And then we went through just a whole bunch of stuff, understanding their system. We mapped their system and who's connected to what systems. We mapped the physical system, and they had this incredible intimate knowledge of their community and of what was happening. And again, it sparked off a conversation about a woman who lived on a property on her own, and, you know, she had no access to, you know, lots of services, but also she had locked gates. Her husband had died and she was quite insecure living on the property on her own. They didn't have, no one had keys, only the next door neighbour had a key, and he was an interstate truck driver. And, you know, if something happened to this woman, that people had no way of just calling in to check on her and all sorts of stuff. And so that started off this whole conversation about sort of who's vulnerable in their community and why. They did a survey at the local show to understand people's preparedness and their ability to recover and their connectedness. When you did the survey, you got a box full of information and a plastic tub that was a go box, and it had a list on the top of things that you should take with you in an emergency, etc. Then they had a little competition to say, send us a photo of your go box. And, you know, someone sent in that theirs was full of, you know, a few tins of beer and a bottle of rum and a tin of Milo. I'm not sure how long they're going to survive on their own, but, you know, just these little things. And then they started a little process because of this sense of disconnection between people. It's this thing called beer and chips. And what it was it couldn't have been simpler, that they asked people to host on the roadside near their farm, in different locations, to host an event where you had to come, there was rules, you had to come in your own clothes that you were wearing at the time. So it didn't matter what you were wearing, you know, if you come out of the workshop or, you know, whatever you were doing, you just turned up in your own clothes. They had some beers and chips, bags of chips on the backs of utes, and they just had conversations about the world and what was happening. And sometimes they talked about this stuff and resilience and mental health, sometimes they didn't. And, you know, but we had a woman come back and say that process saved her husband's life, you know, that prior to that, he'd, you know, been potentially someone who was suicidal, but actually this simple connection of people, and it was so simple, you know, it was done on such a small scale and such a simple scale that it was very doable. And then they went on and won an award, Resilience New South Wales Award, for their work. This, you know, really simple kind of work, but really powerful work for their community. So that's a little case study of this stuff in practice. Last couple of points, conscious we're running short on time. Just in summary, you know, resilience is a people process. It's about understanding people, how they're impacted by disruption and adversity, and it's central to resilience. That's got to be our focus at the centre. It's about people and their health and well-being, because if we get that right, we have happy people, we have happy communities, and then happy communities do great things and can innovate and, you know, create a real vitality and vibrancy about them, and that's a great place for people to be. People are embedded in systems, and we can understand and build resilience through a system lens. You know, that's our way in, if you like, to kind of structured way in. And then, in my view, you know, community resilience is really best worked at by communities themselves, supported and enabled by government and other organisations. This is something that has to come from within, not from without. And I think I'm done, yeah. So I'm going to leave it there and hand back to Jackie and open it up for some questions.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks so much for that. It's a whirlwind tour of community resilience, so very much appreciated though. And I know, yeah, there's some things that sit with me, and hopefully when we talk about the DRFR program, communities, some of our representatives today might have some ideas that are starting to form around how the program could be supporting that capacity to explore what resilience means to them. I'd like to open it up to the floor, and this is a potentially dangerous thing to do with 38 people online, but I'm going to try it anyway. We haven't had anyone post a question in the chat feed, and before I throw out my question, I'm going to invite anyone that might have a burning question on their mind to unmute themselves and ask their question. And if we don't have anything, then I'll jump in. But would anyone like to? Is anything sitting on anyone's mind that they'd like to ask in regards to what Paul's shared today? We're going to have an opportunity to have a chat about it as a group in a minute anyway, but I thought I'd put it out there. Questions or stewing on it? All right. Well, Paul, one of the things that I'll jump in and throw a question out. Well, actually, sorry, I've just seen the chat feed there. Margot's asked a question. I wonder how the systems idea mobilised in Yeovil. What was the catalyst for that?
Yeah, you know, it took, like always, it took a person. So it took someone to kind of have the vision, and they were driving along in another community, and they saw people trying to recover from bushfires, and they realised that there's the formal response of bushfire recovery, and then you know, everyone sort of, the emergency services go home and the community's left to deal with it themselves. And she recognised that, you know, people in that other community were really struggling, and she thought, I need to do something in my community. So the system kind of idea was really about largely about understanding what are the services that are provided, what are the connections between services, who are the people that connect, etc., etc. So a lot of it was really around mapping services and then trying to work out where the gaps were. And they did a really simple thing again. They just invited all of the services to come along as service providers. So, you know, emergency service providers, but also all of the other sorts of supports that were out there, financial counselling and you know, churches, all sorts of other things, and actually just got them all together in one room and mapped some of that. And the value of that was actually, the most inspiring thing of that was what the services learned themselves about each other, and where the gaps were and where they were duplicating. And so a whole bunch of things kicked off from the services about the way they were providing things to the community. So yeah. Again, you know, fairly simple idea, but actually quite powerful. And look, you know, that community is struggling now with COVID in the same, you know, way that all communities are, and that group is struggling. They haven't done much for about a year, but their last kind of effort, which is going to ramp up again now, or is starting to, is to talk about buying 3 shipping containers, which I think they've bought, and to stock those with the resources that they need for the first 3 to 5 days after an event. And, you know, looking at the events that had happened with the summer fires in last year, you know, they saw that, in fact, their communities weren't very prepared, their local governments weren't very prepared, and they could see the impacts that had happened elsewhere. And again, so they decided, well, okay, we need to provide some of our own services here. And so the systems idea kicked in again. It's like, well, what do we need, and where do we get it, and how do we put it in one place so that it's accessible? So it's been interesting to watch how they've kind of used those ideas to kind of carry forward. Yeah, great. Thank you. We haven't had any extra questions popped in the chat feed. I'll just pause again to see if anyone wants to take themselves off mute and ask it, you know, using their own voice. But if not, we'll... Hi, Fiona. Thank you for popping up your hand.
Hi. I couldn't find my electronic hand. Paul, I think that last question to me was the beginning of mine, question, which was like, how do you get started? How do you, it says it's community led. Lots of people have bright ideas. There's money and services out there. It's that connecting bit. So you said that there was one particular person who wanted to take it on, and then you talked about they. How do you go from one person going, oh, we need to do this, to they?
Yeah, good question, Fiona. I mean, she literally tapped a very small group of people on the shoulder then and had a conversation and said, I can't do this on my own. And she was an outsider. That was the other interesting thing. So she was new to the community, or newish to the community. She'd only been there a couple of years. So she tracked down a few key community connectors and got them together. And then they went another circle out and said, we should have this person and this person. And we ended up with that group of sort of 15 or whatever it was. And look, some of those people, a couple dropped out and a couple of other new ones came in. And but what we were searching for were people that didn't want to be out the front. They were people that wanted to work behind the scenes, and they collectively agreed on that very early on. So the first kind of session we all had together, we just told stories about resilience, and then we said, well, if we were going to work together as a group to do something about this in our community, what would that look like? And they defined the process, and they defined the way they'd work together. And they were, I mean, I'm not sure, you know, they're a pretty unique bunch of people. They were a really good combination of skills. There was the classic kind of good organisers through to, you know, the great storytellers, and they worked well together. And that doesn't always happen. You know, I've had the opposite for sure. You know, it's hard to get the right combination of people, but I think their process of getting together and then saying, how will we work? How do we want to work? And, you know, this idea of working behind the scenes, not in front, was a really important notion. They didn't want to be leading. They didn't want to be banging people on the head to do things. They wanted to work behind the scenes to create connections and put people together in conversations and those sorts of things. I think there's some good lessons there.
Can I ask one more? So when did you get involved? What was to get?
I got involved after the sort of initial conversation of the person getting two or three people together for a coffee. It was kind of like, okay, we need some structure here to this process, and we need a little bit of help to plan that, because it's not easy for everyone to kind of think about, well, how will we have this conversation? And so they looked for some outside help, and yeah, you know, they had a small amount of funding that we used to help, you know, cover some time for me, but also cover some time for other outside help. And that's, I guess, in my mind, the really important point is they led it. The community led it. They were just supported and enabled. And I think that's the model that works best. I think everywhere that we've tried to do it, this type of work where it's been top down or imposed, it just fails. It just fails because there's not the desire for the community to drive it themselves. So, and so my job really was to help just provide a structure for the conversation, and essentially to keep people focused on a few key, you know, this is where we're trying to get to, and the lots of, you know, great stories and conversations and lots of time spent chewing over stuff, but coming back to this idea of what are we trying to distill out here, what are we trying to get out of this, and just helping people to constantly come back to this idea of what are we trying to work on here, what's the core ideas that we're trying to work on. But it's light touch, you know, it was really light touch for me in terms of that stuff. It was really just a little bit of structure and a bit of guidance around conversations.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, Paul, for that. And I mean, just really resonates with what we're trying to achieve in terms of the supports and resources that we're looking to provide through the Disaster Resilient Future Ready program. So we might continue this conversation in smaller groups, because I'd love, Nigel, I can see you there. I'm going to ask you to hold on to that question because we have more time at the end of the session, but we'll definitely get to you at the end. But to have a bit of a chat as in smaller groups. So we'll go a bit deeper. In a moment, I'll be bumping you into separate rooms for about 12 minutes, all of my friendly facilitators. There will be a FRRR staff member or University of Sydney supporter in your room, and they'll be helping you to sort of have a bit of a chat about some of the things that Paul's presentation has raised for you, and have a chat about any questions you have. Thanks everyone, that was whirlwind, and I'm sure there was a lot more to share and to be discussed, but and look, I encourage you to keep having those conversations locally, and if there was anyone you wanted to connect with in your group after today's session, please let me know and I'll facilitate an intro. What I'm going to do now is build on what Paul has shared and sort of bring it into the Disaster Resilient Future Ready program, which is sort of part of the reason and opportunity for us here today. Of course, if you've got any questions as I go through this, please pop them in the chat feed because I will be able to see them. I'll answer them as I go, but also we're going to have some time at the end to answer any questions. So some of you might be familiar with the program already because I have probably spoken to you, but there is a few new people in the room. So I'll just take a moment to provide a quick overview and then start to go into what it actually looks like to participate in the program if community is interested in doing so. So the Disaster Resilient Future Ready program, or DRFR, so I'm going to start calling it DRFR just to move through things. It's a national initiative that aims to support and strengthen the capacity and capability of remote, rural and regional communities so that they thrive and are resilient to the impacts of climate, natural disasters and other disruptions. So similar, those stresses and system level aspects that Paul was talking about today. The program began in 2017 after FRRR and several program partners agreed that research was required to understand what it took for communities to be better prepared, but also, and probably more importantly, that there was a real need for practical and evidence-based methods and tools that to be made available for communities so that they can adapt them and work to strengthen their resilience to disruptions and disasters. So this was in a context of a growing understanding that the occurrence of natural disasters in particular in rural, regional and remote communities was on the rise with significant consequences such as mental health issues, impacts to health and wellbeing and increased disadvantage. And Paul spoke to that earlier. So the program is underpinned by a series of beliefs and assumptions informed by over our 20 years of working with communities around Australia. And that is that communities that are engaged, connected, empowered and have high social capital are able to respond and recover better from natural disasters than those with lesser capacity. That they're best placed to determine the most effective approaches to building their capacity and capabilities for their situation and context. And that effective resourcing can be a real enabler and a catalyst for them to do so. So, drawing from what Paul shared today, how can we as an organisation be providing with effective resources, relationships, networks, people? How can we create a space and a platform for communities to tap into those things and to enable them to lead and strengthen their resilience? So the program started out in New South Wales as a pilot project with 3 communities. And through the project and the embedded research process that the communities participated in, we've been able to demonstrate some of the key components or pillars of community resilience through this work. And these relate, I think, very much to what we heard from Paul today. We're going to continue to explore this in the Victorian iteration of the program with our community partners and with our research partners at the University of Sydney, of which Margot and Amanda are here today online with us. So as I said, I think at the start of today's session, the DRFR program is a little bit different for FRRR. It is a multi-year place-based initiative and it does seek to create that space and support for community-led approaches, as I said. So it brings together and provides a variety of supports so that we can bring together community members and organisations to learn from and collaborate with each other. We aim to bring supports that allow community to build their capacity and knowledge by connecting them with professional mentoring, technical assistance and training. We're able to sort of provide access to grant funding that allows communities to allocate that where they need it to go and build their capacity for action and delivery of strategic initiatives. And we also are here, sort of one of the supports is that we are keen to develop cross-sector relationships and to influence and support the coordination of those formal systems so that they're more responsive and serving community-defined resilience outcomes and priorities. And in our chat, breakout room that we just had, we were talking about that relationship with some of those more formal structures and how communities can show the value and be heard and actually work really productively and with the respect and value with those more formal systems. And the other support that we do provide or are able to provide through the program is that we can facilitate action learning processes, so we can be responsive, adaptive, and really ground all decisions and actions in evidence as we're working together. So that's some of the supports that the DRFR program aims to provide to communities. So the DRFR program offers the opportunity for communities to participate in the program through one of two streams. So these streams and supports and the resources within them have been developed based on our experience through the DRFR program in New South Wales, a review of the existing body of knowledge that exists across the sector, as well as our discussions with all of you. You know, I've been chatting with you all for several months now to really hear where you're at and to hear what you're doing. And this is partly in response to that in terms of how these streams have been structured. So the first is the community initiative stream. And this is designed to support a really focused activity or initiative that acts as a catalyst for individual and community actions that build social capital and strengthen resilience. And then the second is the community collective stream, which focuses on the community's collective effort to lead and work together towards a common vision and plan on activities and interventions over a period of time and really act as a coordinated network or system. And across both, we aim to facilitate connection, knowledge sharing and networking between community members from different groups where there is interest and value in us doing so. So the two streams in which a community can participate and the supports within each, they slightly differ as a result of the different focus, which probably goes without saying. And each stream is supported in terms of the sort of tangible way in which that works. Each stream would be supported with a facilitated co-creation process at the start, so a series of workshops to really kickstart the partnership and that community building effort. And then also to support the mapping out of priorities and what appropriate supports and resources looks like. And then they're moving into the next phase of really mobilising these resources and supports and activities as led by each community. So we've only got 10 minutes, so I'm going to whip through what this actually looks like and the level of support. It's all going to be available in a document that I'll share with you after today's session. So don't worry if I don't go into all of the detail today. But the community initiative stream is potentially suited for a community or representative group of members that may be interested in the program, but not necessarily interested or have the capacity to drive a whole of collective action movement, similar to the oval example that Paul provided today. So it may be suitable for a community that already have coordinated networks in their communities. And I've had the pleasure of connecting with a few of them through the community groups that are here today. You may already have a backbone organisation that works across the community, and instead you want to focus on strengthening these organisations or systems, or focusing on a priority area that the community has identified as important. So there is a range of supports that you can see there that would be available through that stream if your community was participating in that way. And that again ranges from grant funding to resource support and capacity building activities. And that would be for a time frame for 12 to 18 months, but we're a bit flexible on that considering all of the things that are happening in our world today with COVID. So some examples of what that might look like. You know, there's lots of great examples in Victoria and Australia and indeed overseas. So it could range from a disaster preparedness activity. So really thinking about that top of the iceberg, you know, what might be a really targeted activity that supports preparedness in my community. It might be about connectedness. So how might we have an initiative that actually supports a community to connect after a time where we've been potentially quite isolated. It could also be about providing support and resources into that organisation that's already playing a really galvanising role in your community. So these types of activities, as I said, have the potential to build resilience in themselves, but also to catalyse other opportunities for action across those that participate. So that's the community initiative stream. The second stream, the community collective stream, is more suitable for communities who are seeking to bring different organisations, activities and resources together towards that shared goal, shared vision, and to develop a plan for community resilience and how they're going to work collectively and in alignment to build and strengthen their capacity over time. So you can see here that the resources and supports are again slightly different. The other opportunity within the collective stream is to work and partner with the University of Sydney and ourselves through going through to understand how activities and resources and actions and processes strengthen resilience and be a community research partner throughout the time that you're participating. The collective stream also provides, you know, has the opportunity to go for a little bit longer as required by the community groups that are supporting it. And we would also be there to support the community to establish a sustainable resourcing model so that they can continue the work beyond the active phase of the DRFR program. So again, the example that Paul gave is really, you know, what the community collective stream could look like or be about. Some other examples here are the Tarnagulla community, for example, who, through a really participatory approach over a period of time, they did develop a vision and developed a plan that was really holistic about how what actions and ways in which they could enhance their resilience across both physical, social, cultural, environmental, particularly in response to the changing climate that they were experiencing and some of the economic changes that were happening as well. And another example is our Investing in Rural Communities Futures program at the foundation at FRRR, where it supports actually the local networks of not-for-profits in a community to build their capacity, to support them to share resources and really strengthen that not-for-profit and volunteering sector in the local community. So there's some examples of what the community collective stream could look like. Representatives from both of the streams have the opportunity to participate in the communities network, which is designed to support that cross-community pollination that's really exciting and you know, really engaging a lot of the time, but also to tap into opportunities for networking and learning more broadly across the sector, because there's lots of things happening in the space and there's heaps of things to learn from. Representatives that have engaged in the process to date, but the community choose not to participate, are also welcome to join the network to stay connected and to see what other opportunities might be on the horizon with FRRR or with our partners from the sector as well. So there is that opportunity to be part of that into the future also. So in terms of where we're at now in the process of the Victorian program, so I've had lots of questions from you all about how were these 7 communities shortlisted, and we did go through last year a real data-driven process that utilised a lot of information in our grants database, but also that's available in Australia, looking at a range of sources, but particularly the sort of hazard and exposure information. And we shortlisted the group of 7 communities of which you're all joining from today. Over the last few months, had the great opportunity of chatting with you all and reviewing new literature and information that exists in the sector around community-led approaches to resilience. And we've adapted our program model and approach from the New South Wales program. And so this workshop marks a real shifting of gears for the program, and it kicks off this explore, readiness and EOI phase. And that's to be carried out over the next month or so. We are going to be flexible with timeframes again, depending on what develops with COVID and restrictions over the next little while. And then following that, once we've gone through the EOI, a group of community partners will be selected for the program, and then we'll activate those co-creation activities with partners. So where to now? Well, after this session, I'll connect with those that are interested in the program to coordinate a community conversation. And that's really to answer questions, discuss the process, facilitate potentially some readiness conversations in your community, both within the group that's interested, but potentially more broadly, and explore what else those that are representing in that group might need to get a pulse of their community support for participating in the program. I have dates and times for some conversations already lined up with some of the communities in the call today. And so if you are interested in joining or organising one for your own community, please do get in touch with me. In the lead up to these meetings, I'll be sending out an invitation to participate in the program and the EOI information, as well as the prompting questions that form part of the EOI. And from there, I'll be happy to work with and support communities that would like to participate and support them with their submission. So it's important to note that community representatives that are interested need to coordinate amongst each other what your response will be if you'd like to put in an EOI, because we just have one submission per community. It's not necessary to have an idea of what your initiative might be or your plan of activities for either stream, but really we're just looking in the EOI for that willingness and enthusiasm to participate, ability to demonstrate, and for you to demonstrate interest, capacity, and the mindset to explore opportunities in the program. We're really conscious of community capacity and strain on volunteer resources at the moment, and so the EOI process is not designed to be onerous at all. And we welcome creative ways in which a community might like to respond to the prompting questions that will be part of the EOI. And yeah, I think that can be a conversation to have with you all as a group, but we're really keen to see some creative stuff happen there. So that's sort of the process in how we will move from a group of 7 into the streams of activity for the program. I'm going to turn off the slide now and just pause to see everyone's faces again, which is great. And I'd love if anyone has any questions I acknowledge I've gone a bit over time, but if there's any questions, please feel free to stay on the line and ask them, and I will happy to provide a response for a few minutes. But before we jump into questions, if there is any, I'd just really like to thank you all today for coming along. And I'd really, really like to thank Paul for giving his time and sharing some of his insights with us all. And I really hope that whether or not you participate in the DRFR program, that you've taken something away to think about more broadly and ongoing. So thank you to Paul.